Hi, this is Brenden Lowe, founder of Jazz Piano School, and you are listening to the Musicality Podcast.
Ever wondered why some people seem to have a gift for music? Have you ever wished that you could play by ear, sing in tune, improvise and jam? You're in the right place. Time to turn those wishes into reality. Welcome to the Musicality Podcast with your host, Christopher Sutton.
Hi, this is Christopher, founder of Musical U, and welcome to the Musicality Podcast. Today, as part of Improv Month, I'm speaking with Brenden Lowe, the man behind jazzpianoschool.com and the Jazz Piano School podcast. Jazz and piano can both be intimidating things for aspiring musicians, and they put front and center their belief that anyone can learn, as well as encouraging self-expression from the outset. So they're clearly a good match for our philosophy here at Musical U. Jazz Piano School has a unique approach to teaching, and I was keen to hear more about how it works and how improvisation factors in. In this conversation, we talk about the astonishing number of jazz tunes Brenden could play after $12,000 of traditional jazz piano lessons, and why he was completely unsure how to improvise or be creative. We talk about the Lego bricks approach to improvising that makes it easy to learn step by step. And we talk about the unique 4-step system they use at Jazz Piano School to connect theory, technique, improv, and repertoire at every stage of learning. This was a really fun conversation, and Brenden has a great way of explaining things that cut straight through any intimidation factor. Whether you have any interest in jazz or in piano, I think you're going to dig this. My name is Christopher Sutton, and this is the Musicality Podcast from Musical U. Welcome to the show, Brenden. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd love to start at the very beginning and understand where you came from as a musician. Where did you first start learning music, and what was that like for you?
Yeah, so my family's been into music. My dad's a musician, so we always had a piano around, and I would just go and sit down at the piano and start playing. And so they thought, well, why don't we just give him piano lessons? So I started taking piano lessons when I was a kid. And I took classical lessons, obviously, just a dozen a day. I can't really remember the name of the exercises, but just beginner piano. And so then it was about, I think I was like 10 or so. I took classical lessons all the way up until then, and I kept taking classical lessons. But when I was 10, I was always trying to change the music, like change the Bach I was playing, change the Mozart. My teachers would always yell at me, I'd be like, oh, it sounds better when I play it like this, though. like I thought I could change Bach, And so eventually I heard my first jazz album. That was an album with Oscar Peterson and Itzhak Perlman, a classical violinist, like not the best jazz album to start off with. But hearing classical people make transitions is funny. But something changed in me, it was like it clicked when I heard that jazz album, and I was like, this is what I need, right? I just needed to learn how to get that feeling, to recreate the feeling that I felt, and I wanted to self-express myself, through the music of improvisation like Oscar Peterson was doing. So at that point, I continued to study classical music, but then I started taking jazz, and so that's really where my kind of jazz and improv journey started at that point. And I eventually just kind of made the leap. I stopped taking classical music. I'd taken about 15 years of classical, and then I just solely dedicated myself to taking jazz.
Very cool. And roughly how old were you when you heard that album, do you think?
I think I was about 10. Wow. So it must have been like fifth or sixth grade.
Interesting.
Because I'd been looking for something. Yeah, I'd been looking for something besides classical. Like I liked classical, but it was just, like I said, I was always sitting it down at the piano, playing my own stuff. Like I wanted to do my own thing. So I would put new notes in like the Bach minuets and things like that. And finally I heard that album and I was like, this is what I need.
Interesting, because I think to the average 10-year-old, jazz, and particularly jazz harmony, is not the most accessible sound. I think a lot of people find they need to get a lot more experienced in music before jazz really becomes accessible to them.
That's definitely true. Yeah, I don't think so, because we had it playing a lot. Like my parents would play jazz, so my ear. I think a lot of people subconsciously, as you're growing up, music is in your ear and you are taking it in, whether you understand it or not. You're still listening to it. Some people, when they're in the womb, they put the headphones on the their wife's belly and stuff like that to play music, which I think is awesome. I'm definitely going to do that with my first child. But yeah, so I think I was taking it in. And then when I got to that point where I heard the album, everything was just like clicked, So I think Oscar's sound was what I had been looking for. And he ended up being my first like really true inspiration to jazz piano.
So that's super interesting. We talk about that sometimes at Musical U as passive ear training, where you are developing your musical ear, but you're not, doing exercises. You're not consciously trying to do it. But it sounds like you were really immersed in that jazz tradition even before you ever thought to play it yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely listening to a lot of the stuff.
And did you find it came easy to you? You clearly had the instinct to create and to experiment in music, but at the same time, jazz isn't the simplest genre to dive into. Did you find that was an easy transition for you? Did it all come directly?
To everyone listening out there, this is my story, and absolutely not. It did not come easy. So it was one of the hard. Jazz piano is freaking hard, and this is how I tell my story on my website and at Jazz Piano School and to all my followers out there. But it's one of the hardest things that I've ever done. And so just to give you guys a little teaser, but when I started taking jazz piano, I took 3 years of jazz piano lessons because I wanted to learn jazz piano after I'd heard that Oscar album. I took a lesson a week for 3 years at $70. I think it was about $70 to $75 a week. So if you guys do the math on that, it's about $11,000 to $12,000 I'd spent on jazz piano lessons for 3 years. And if I asked you how many tunes I learned, how many tunes would you guess I learned?
I guess hundreds.
Right. I learned 3 tunes. So I had spent $12,000 on jazz piano lessons, and I learned 3 tunes. So it was at that point that obviously I felt very disappointed, frustrated, embarrassed because I spent my parents' money. Like I had barely learned any tunes. And the 3 tunes I did learn, they were all I could play. Like I couldn't play any other jazz tunes besides those 3 tunes because I had copied what my teacher had showed me. So my first experience with jazz piano improvisation was I went into the lesson. This would happen a lot, but obviously the first time it was shocking to me. So I sat down at the piano. I was trying to learn. He would play. He was showing me the tune If I Were a Bell. So I learned 3 tunes. I mean, this is burnt into my memory. If I Were a Bell, Yesterdays, and Beautiful Love. Those are the 3 tunes I could play. So he was showing me If I Were a Bell. He was playing all these cool licks and things like that. And I was just like amazed, blown away, like we all are when we're trying to learn improv. And then finally he stops, and it's about like half an hour in. He's talking and playing just for forever. And I'm just like, yeah, awesome. I want to learn how to do this. I'm so pumped. I'm excited. I'm like, so he stops. And then I'm like, all right, so when I go home, what should I practice to learn how to do this? Like, how do I learn this? And he's like, weren't you just watching what I showed you? And I was like, yeah, and he's like, yeah, I just showed you how to do it. And it was at that point I was just like, this is a mess, So the only way I learned those 3 tunes, I could only play those 3 tunes because I had copied his arrangements of what he had played. So I could play those 3 tunes basically based off of what he had played. I didn't know how to flip to any other tunes to create what I wanted to self-express in jazz or how I wanted to recreate the sounds I felt when I heard Oscar. I could only play those 3 tunes, and nowhere was I even close to jazz piano freedom or improvisational freedom. And I just spent $12,000. So it was at that point that I was like, man, something is wrong here.
Wow. And for the kid who went into jazz because he, found himself experimenting with Bach, that sounds incredibly painful.
Yes, it was. It's very painful. And so that's the pain point I'm sure that I found to be true with almost 99% of all jazz learners, jazz people trying to learn jazz. And that's why I started Jazz Piano School. So
bridge that gap for us then. You had this terrible experience with a fairly traditional approach to jazz education. And now you have a jazz piano school where you teach in a very different way, in a much more free and creative way. What were the milestones or epiphanies along the way that led to you understanding a better way to do this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So basically, I was determined. A lot of people will quit, as I've seen, in students. And this was like the only thing I wanted in life. So I just kept going. I quit actually after those first 3 years, started studying again with a new teacher, took another 2 lessons, spent a lot of money, quit again, started with a new teacher. It's just like a cycle, And so I actually ended up going to music school just because I loved it. I got my jazz performance degree. But even after I graduated from college, it was still the same thing. Like I didn't feel that I was content about my playing, and I could sit down and truly self-express what I was trying to say through the music. I didn't feel like I had a plan of action. I didn't feel like I had structure or organization to continually get better and make progress at jazz piano, succeed. So I started, it was actually one day, like I'd spoken to you about language learning blocks, because I was in a French class and I was taking French, and basically I was thinking about learning languages. And so when you're learning a language, if you are going to France and you want to speak French, you want to be able to speak freely, right? You want to be able to just go there and be able to speak and express yourself, like have a conversation. So if I was thinking about how my teacher was teaching me these different sentences, and so she was teaching us in a very structured way. She obviously, when you learn English, you're learning verbs, you're learning nouns, pronouns, you're learning sentence structure, but you're learning those components so that you can speak freely in a conversation, right? You're not really copying what she's saying. So if she said, for example, I want you to copy this sentence, how do I find the nearest corner store, right? If you copied that sentence, you're not going to understand all the verbs, the nouns, and pronouns that fit into the sentence. If you go to France, the only sentence you're going to be able to say is, how do you get to the nearest corner store? If you wanted to say, how do you get to, you wouldn't really understand how to add anything onto the back end because you've only copied that one sentence. Whereas if she's teaching us the word how, to get, to, then we can start to replace any nouns on the end of that to make multiple types of sentences leading to freedom in the language. So, long story short, it was from that I started to create these, what I call theory sequences, where we're taking a core theory tool and moving it through these building blocks and fitting it into a jazz sentence that basically leads someone to learn a core jazz theory tool like improvisation and things like that to start to create jazz piano freedom. And I vowed to teach all my students with this method because it started to help me so much. I actually made more progress with my own developments in like the next 3 to 6 months after my epiphany than I had in like the past 10 years. I just skyrocketed my improvement. And I got to the point where I was freely expressing myself due to the work I had put in through the structure and development of these proven language learning blocks. So I vowed to teach all my students with structure, organization, and direction, not with generalities, not with the traditional methods of I'm going to show you, you copy me, just listen, go listen to more jazz and you'll figure it out. Like these are all the things I would hear when I was a kid, just use your ear and you'll get it. Like, no.
Fantastic.
So I just to say some things, a lot of the traditional methods like you brought up before too, is that those things do obviously come into play. I'm not saying that copying licks and things like that isn't good for a person's improvement, but when you're first starting, I truly believe nailing down in a structured manner these proven learning language blocks that fit into jazz is going to build your foundation and then lead you to the point where you're able to use different types of textures and structures that people have in order to fit that into your playing at a later point in your progression.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think your 4-step framework for teaching jazz piano is definitely one of the most distinctive things about jazz piano school, and I'd love to just unpack that a little bit. You mentioned it in passing there, but can you explain what those 4 steps are? Because I think it's really elegant the way you link up theory and improv and repertoire, and that's not something that a lot of people experience in their music learning. It tends to all be a bit disjointed or scattered.
Right. Yeah, so basically the best way to describe this is if you are building a house, right? Or you want to build something. So a lot of in jazz, classical is a different kind of beast because we have the music in front of us, right? In jazz, our goal is to sit down and freely express ourselves through the music with no music. if that makes sense, right? We want to express ourselves freely through the music with no music. But in classical, you put the music in front of you, you read it, you study it, everything's right there. So with jazz, right, when we're building our house, our blueprint is our final product that we want to get to. So that's the house. The blueprints in jazz are jazz fake books, right? The charts. Jazz charts are basically our blueprints. They're the structure. They're telling us what we need to go, where we need to play, what we can do. Here's the melody. Most people start with the blueprint, but they have no tools to build the house. So you can have a blueprint of a $1 million mansion, but if you go to build that $1 million mansion without tools, it's absolutely impossible, right? So the tools that I teach in jazz piano school get you to look at any blueprint, any jazz chart, and you will freely be able to build any jazz chart you want or play, right? You can play any jazz chart you want because you have the tools to do that. So if I break down the theory, the theory sequence, I call them in jazz piano school, we take a theory tool. So that can be anything. And to give some examples, it could be seventh chords, it could be triads, major triads, minor triads, it could be any sort of scale, any sort of theory tool that has like a purpose, right, in music. So, and again, relating this back, I use this analogy a lot, just the construction analogy. If we have a hammer, right, if you have a tool that is a hammer, like a seventh chord or something like that, just because I have a hammer doesn't mean like I know how to use it, doesn't mean I know how to freely use it, doesn't mean I know what its purpose is for. Like a lot of people, there's two sides to a hammer, so you hit stuff on the one end of the hammer. It doesn't necessarily know what someone knows, or it doesn't mean that someone knows what the back end of the hammer is for, right? So the first thing in the theory sequence is that you need to understand the total functionality of a theory tool. So like, what is its purpose? So a seventh chord, right? You need to understand what the purpose of a seventh chord is, or a major seventh chord, or a triad, right? Once we understand that, then we know the functionality of that tool. Then we progress to our second step in the theory sequence, which I call technique. So once I have a hammer and I know what I can do with a hammer, I need to practice using my hammer, like hitting nails, like actually hitting it, because I could be terrible at doing that, right? I could miss, I could hit my finger. We don't want to do that, right? So I take my theory tool, playing major triads, and I can practice that in a number of different ways. Now, just to let you know, there's no materials out there for these exercises, right? I've created all the exercises that link in the theory sequence, so there are materials out there, but they're just all jumbled up. It's not sequenced like I'm teaching you. So if we take a major triad, I might outline the major triad. I might outline it going through the circle of fourths. I might play it in a block style. I might play it with my left hand. I might play hands together. So these are all different ways I can use and practice the technique portion of my theory tool. So I'm actually learning how to use my tool. I'm actually swinging the hammer. I'm learning how to not hit my finger as I'm nailing something in, right? The third step we have is improv. Now, the improv portion of this theory sequence is meant to freely use your tool. So if I have a hammer and I've learned how to hit the hammer, hit a nail into the wall, that may be the only thing I know how to do with this tool. But I want to be able to use this tool to build a house. So I need to be able to use a hammer to do many different things, not just hit one nail in one location, if that makes sense. Like I want to be able to use a hammer to hit a baseboard in. I want to be able to use a hammer to, pull screws out. I want to freely be able to use this hammer however I want, not just for one purpose, right? So for major triads in improv, right, I want to freely be able to use these major triads however I want. And so by practicing specific building blocks or specific improv exercises that relate to the major triad, I can start to improvise over the major triads. I can use the notes within the major triad to solo with. So this improv exercise is teaching us freedom within the theory tool to give us freedom over that tool, over that one specific tool. That way I can use it however I want. And then finally, the last step is repertoire, where we integrate all the previous work we've just done, which isn't much. I mean, it's a couple exercises within each step, and we integrate that into repertoire. So we start to integrate that into tunes, aka we start to build our house with the hammer, right? However we want. We now have this tool at our disposal. We can use it however we want because we've practiced the use of it. We've practiced the freedom use of it. I know how to do everything I can with this tool. I can now use it in any tune I want rather than being handcuffed by just copying someone using a hammer, which would only allow me to use that hammer in the exact situation that I had just watched them use it in. And so that's a full theory sequence.
Very cool. And it's so strikingly different from the traditional approach, which, is typically, here's the piece we're going to work on. Let's learn the technique required to play the notes on the page. And then maybe next week, or if you're a bit more advanced, we can take a little bit of this piece and give you the opportunity to improvise, completely separate from everything we've just been learning.
Right.
I love how you build improv into, really into the core of that, so that everything that's taught is taught with the opportunity to use it in a creative way. So in practical terms, what does this look like for the student? How many tools are there to go through? Are they learning one a day, one a week? Do you do all 4 steps for one tool before moving on? What's that like?
That's a good question. Yeah. Well, so obviously there's lots of jazz information, right? So, and there's lots of musical information out there. And I think structuring a way for the students' progress to get them to their goal the fastest is the best thing to do. So if someone's interested in playing, someone might come to me and say, I want to play jazz piano. Okay, that's great. There's lots of jazz piano out there. You can play in group, you can play by yourself, you can play modern tunes, swing tunes, slow tunes, fast tunes. So what catches your ear, right? Then they might say, okay, well, I want to play solo piano because I'm at home most of the time and I have a 9 to 5, right? And I love they may have had an album trigger their love for music just like I did. So maybe they heard Bud Powell, maybe they heard Errol Garner play for the first time in jazz, or even a classical musician, whoever that may be. And they say, I want to play like Errol Garner. And I say, okay, great. So we start to take these different paths for their goal because the different tools are going to lead you to build different houses, right? If I want to build a little shed, I don't need 100 tools, right? I just need a couple ply, some 2x4s. I can build it pretty easily. I'm not going to give 100 tools to someone who wants to build a little shed. So if you just want to play like Errol Garner, that's one specific style, right? He's got a couple techniques that can make him sound like Errol Garner. He has a certain texture. And if you're playing solo piano, that's going to be different than playing with a group. So we try and give these theory sequences or these theory tools to people to get them to their goal the fastest possible so that they can see results, but in a structured and directional manner. So, we just kind of lead them down that path because once you figure out your goal and your objective, you really don't need that many tools besides your foundational learning process. Obviously, if you don't know what a 7th chord is, you're going to need to know that, So there's a bit of a foundation to build there. But then after that, you can really go in the direction you want with these theory sequences and get exactly what you're looking for in a much, much quicker time, not 15 plus years like I had to go through spending college tuition money, so.
Terrific. That's something we're firm believers in ourselves at Musical U, that, you can't do a one-size-fits-all course for music in general. It tends to end up fitting nobody, and you're much better off figuring out the combination of topics and approaches that actually suits their background and their goals and what it is they want to accomplish. So,
right, absolutely.
We've talked a bit about jazz and a bit about piano, but I'm curious to know, a lot of what you've described, I think, is relevant beyond both of those two things. How much do you think this approach would be valuable to someone who wants to learn, say, rock improv on guitar?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really all the same in my teaching style, right? So jazz is an amazing thing because it really encompasses and holds all types of music. The theory and tools you learned in jazz can be used in all types of music. So rock, pop, funk. And it's amazing because so many people are like, Brenden, I just want to play funk, or I just want to play rock, or I just want to play pop. But when you learn these things and you walk through the system that I've created, it allows you to do that with freedom. So by achieving, going through the theory sequences, you're actually creating freedom in all these different styles. Now, obviously a rock style is much different than a jazz style. But when we start to look at it closer, why is it different? And I don't want to take away anything from other styles, but rock and pop only usually contain just, pure fact, a couple of chords. You're not going to see many chords or harmonic or big theory types of tools in rock and pop. You may have 4 triads. A lot of the pop stars that we know this day and age have gotten rich off of 4 chords, right? Just huge, huge hit singles. So jazz is a very, very in-depth process, right? So if you're learning your jazz tools, you're going to be able to play any other style that you want. So if you want to learn rock, I'm not necessarily saying you should learn jazz first, but the jazz tools, the jazz theory components will give you access to everything. So why not start there and have access to rock, have access to pop, have access to funk, have access to everything else, R&B, gospel. Like, it's going to give you everything you need to play all the styles, rather than just saying, okay, I want to play rock, then that's all you learn. Like, you're not going to be able to play jazz. You won't really necessarily be able to play any of these other styles. So I guess I would recommend going towards more of the jazz theory to start with, and then learning that. And then that way you can express yourself however you want in any other style, because a lot of them are great as well. So
it seems like you've struck a really nice balance in the way you teach at Jazz Piano School, in that you are providing very clear and step-by-step teaching. But as we just touched on, it's also quite flexible, so that, students can pick and choose or adapt the path to best suit what they're into.
Yeah.
And this was something that jumped out at me from a great blog post you wrote called My Jazz Piano Freedom, What's Helped and Hurt. We'll put a link to this in the show notes, because I think it's a really great post. But something you mentioned in there was the interplay between structure and freedom when learning. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So, right, a lot of people will say jazz is just freedom, right? So basically people are improvising, and they're just playing spontaneously whatever comes to mind. And I don't know, this is what I hear out there. Sometimes people will say this, but it all starts with freedom. It starts with no structure. But I believe it's actually the complete opposite. I think the more structured you start, the more freedom you're going to have in the long run. So starting with the structure and discipline to learn your tools, like I've talked about on the podcast today, is the best way to get to that freedom point. Whereas if you're starting with complete freedom, you have no tools, and basically you're guessing, you're searching through a haystack to find the needle, right? You're kind of just wandering, you're lost, you don't have a direction. Too much freedom can lead to being nowhere, right? So basically that was my journey. That was my path that I took. And so I didn't have any structure. I didn't have any direction or organization. People were just throwing me things, and I had to take the tools and try and connect them myself. Whereas in jazz piano school, starting with a structured approach to go through these core tools will give you the freedom you need to self-express yourself, right? And however you want. So you can self-express through jazz, through rock, through pop. And by learning those core tools, you're going to achieve that freedom much, much faster than starting with freedom and wandering around trying to explore, right? Just being out there in the abyss of information on the internet these days about music, because there's so much out there. And to assume that you're going to be, see, the thing is, it's like I see people go out there and they have access to all this information. But what happens is, and you'll see this with I love all jazz piano sites and I support education in all manners, but people always say, like, we have the biggest library. We have the biggest library of jazz piano videos. We have the biggest library of rock guitar. And the key word there you have to watch out for is library. Because when you enter in a library, if I were to tell you to go learn history, for example, or, like London's background, okay? If you walked into the George Washington Library or a big library in London and you were asked to do that, would you be able to learn everything you needed to know if you're just walking into a library with thousands of books? Probably not, right? Because you are putting yourself, essentially, you're not the student anymore. You're trying to teach yourself. You're becoming the teacher to inform yourself about how to learn. So when there's these libraries, essentially, you're trying to navigate all the information. Instead of someone saying, okay, go to floor 2, pick out, book 2 on shelf 3, read pages 50 through 60 of that book, then go to floor 5, go to shelf 3, pick up book 2, then read that whole book. With the direction and structure that you're creating from the beginning, you're actually moving down the specific path to learn exactly what you want in order to achieve freedom. Otherwise, again, you're just wandering, you're sifting through this information completely lost. And for you to expect that you're going to learn something because you're the one in charge of all the information to put it all together is almost madness. It's like there's no way that that's going to happen because you're not the teacher, you're the student. You need someone to give you a plan to get to freedom or achieve whatever your goals are.
Absolutely. I think we're in a really interesting age for education, and in particular music education, because there's a trade-off to be made, right? Like we've touched on, a single strict path that a teacher forces you down is not going to work out well, as you experienced in your first 3 years of learning. If it's not the right path or it's not suiting the student, it's a disaster. But at the same time, I think there's far too many people kind of wandering lost in the wilderness of the internet and feeling like they're learning something, but then actually discovering far too late that it's all a jumble and they've wasted months or years just kind of dabbling and scattered in their learning. I remember on a previous episode of the podcast, I was talking with Matthew Scott Phillips and Jeremy Burns from the Music Student 101 podcast, and we were talking a bit about this, how it's a challenge for us as online music educators to find that balance, to give students the freedom to pick their own path while providing enough support and guidance and structure that they're actually making good progress and learning, rather than just wandering around the biggest library in the world. So I really applaud the work you're doing at Jazz Piano School. I think you're finding a good balance there, and in particular in this world of jazz and improvisation, where I think we inherit a lot of romantic notions about the gifted musician who just, he just was shedded for a dozen years and then he just picked up his trumpet and he could play anything. I love that you're helping people get away from that and understand the step-by-step that can be involved.
So the balance too is it's just to say one quick thing on that is it's definitely a hard thing. I've struggled with that for so long, just due to my path, because when you're an outside student, the thing you want to do the most isn't learn scales and learn triads and learn theory tools like I'm talking about. Like, people's ears probably started to glaze over when I was talking a little bit, but you just want to play. It's like you want to play and be happy. That's all I wanted. Like, I just wanted to feel that happiness sensation. It's about feeling, really, not like the theoretical terms. Like, your ultimate goal is to play and be happy. That's honestly like what I believe, what I try and help my students do, because whether you're playing to the level of Oscar Peterson or you're a gig musician, or you're just playing a simple jazz tune at home by yourself, whatever equates to happiness for you, that's where I want to help you get to. But at the same time, it comes from something from within the student that you as a student have to realize there needs to be some sort of discipline involved, because if you're just kind of wandering around trying to just play, then you're not really going to get to that spot you want. So it definitely is a push and pull between what the student wants and what I know is best for you to get what you want, right? So it's definitely a trusting balance between the teacher and the student. So
it's been fantastic to hear more about your approach at Jazz Piano School. I think you've got such a great methodology there for teaching a very complex subject in a flexible and step-by-step way. For the listener who's maybe just getting started in improvising, or maybe is just considering getting started, and they're hopefully through this series of podcast episodes feeling a bit more reassured that it's possible for them, do you have any advice or guidance for them as they get started?
Absolutely. So if anyone's seen the Lego movie out there, I highly recommend you go see it. There's like 3 of them now, the Batman Lego movie, the first one, the second one. Anyway, go see the Lego movie, because you will learn to improvise from that movie. So my whole improvisation approach to is based off of Legos, building blocks, specific improv exercises. Now, as I was growing up, I would hear a lot of things like, just use your ears, just watch me, and then you do it. Just transcribe, just copy licks, right? Play licks. And so I heard that a lot. It never, in my opinion, in my case, in my journey, it never helped me get to the point that I want to get to. So I think a lot of people follow that same path. And I love getting my message out there to share with people that I spent 15 plus years doing that, transcribing, copying licks, playing solos. it never really got me to the point I wanted to. So my teaching is based off of Legos. In the Lego movie, you have people called master builders, right? So these master builders, they can build whatever they want with a pile of Legos. Like when they see a pile of Legos, it's like, oh, I can build this ship, or I can build the White House or something like that. So they don't see a pile of Legos, they see the end result. But did they start there? No, not all Lego people in the world are master builders, right? So when we start, I'm sure like most 99%, did you play with Legos?
For sure, yeah.
Have you ever used Legos
Absolutely.
before? Yeah, I think everyone's played with Legos. They know what Legos are. So when you start building Legos, if you're not starting with like the Death Star, you're not building a Death Star Lego thing. You start with like a little tiny boat, right? And in the instruction manual, it shows you 3 Legos. So you have 3 Legos, you have 3 building blocks, and you're putting them together. Now, later down the road, when you see those 3 building blocks, are you going to be able to use those to do whatever you want? Yes, absolutely, because you've used them before in step-by-step manner. So you start with small step-by-step manner. So if you're learning how to improvise, for example, you need to learn the building blocks of improvisation. So if you want to learn how to improvise like whoever, like a guitar solo, like AC/DC, Van Halen, it doesn't even have to be jazz, like Norah Jones, pop, like whatever. There's building blocks that relate to specific exercises in improv. So if we wanted to take a major triad, right, the building block I would use for improv around the major triad would just to use those 3 notes for improv. So I would use, like for a C major triad, C, E, G. We have 3 notes. The building block for improv around that would be to improvise using 3 notes, just C, E, and G. Now, once I've learned that, I start to learn that building block through all triads. So I can improvise through an F major triad using F, A, and C. So that's just 1 Lego. Like I have 1 Lego now in my collection, right? Then I will learn another Lego. So if I get to any major triad, I can improvise using those 3 notes. Now, if I put on a 7th on top, right? So maybe I have a dominant 7th on top of the chord, C, E, G, B flat. So now I have 4 notes. So now I have 2 Legos, right? And I can put those together. So if I see a major triad or I see a 7th chord, I've learned those Lego improvisation building blocks because I'm practicing small, specific improv exercises related to the theory tool. I'm not just practicing a whole transcription. I'm not just copying a lick. I'm learning improv exercises that are small building blocks that relate to a theory tool. That way it helps me achieve quick, fast freedom within my improvisation. And I have Legos at my disposal to use and build like a master builder in the Lego movie.
Awesome. I think that's a terrific analogy for people to keep in mind because, as we've talked about, improv can be a huge subject and jazz can be an intimidatingly complex genre. But I think that idea of, assembling your tools, assembling your Legos, and then bringing those to each improv is a great way to think about it. Fantastic. Thank you so much again for joining us on the show today, Brenden.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Hey, Christopher here. I hope you're enjoying Improv Month. A couple of things I wanted to let you know about. The first is we're running a free improvisation masterclass at the end of the month. It's on Saturday, 31st of March, 2018, and you can sign up to watch it live online at musicalitypodcast.com/improv. The second is that we're running a special promotion at the end of the month to celebrate the launch of our new improv roadmap at Musical U. You can get a great deal on Musical U membership, and we're giving you, as a podcast listener, exclusive early access and a special bonus gift. If you've thought about joining Musical U, you won't want to miss this. Check out the details at that same link, musicalitypodcast.com/improv. It's funny, I tend not to go too heavy on analogy and metaphor when explaining things myself, but after talking with Brenden, I found myself rethinking that. Because I know that his descriptions in terms of tools and Lego blocks and libraries are all going to stick with you. Let's do a quick recap. Brenden grew up with jazz in the house, but it wasn't until after a few years of classical piano that he heard an Oscar Peterson record and suddenly realized that jazz was the music he yearned to play. Unfortunately, what followed were a few very frustrating years of learning with a jazz piano teacher and never really achieving any freedom or creativity due to the rote learning method used, and vague instructions to just copy what the teacher did. Fortunately, his burning desire to be a jazz pianist meant that Brenden stuck with it, and after a series of teachers and a pivotal moment realizing that learning jazz piano could and should be like learning a language, he developed his own unique approach to learning and teaching jazz. At Jazz Piano School, Brenden uses a 4-step theory sequencing methodology, where students are introduced to a single theory tool, and then once they understand how it's used, they practice using it themselves, improvising with it, and connecting it with repertoire like lead sheets for jazz standards. I love how improvisation is integrated throughout the learning process there, and every concept in the wide world of jazz is presented in a way that immediately empowers you not just to understand it and play it, but to use it creatively through improvisation from the start. We talked about the blessing and curse of the modern music learning landscape, that a self-guided learner today with access to the internet has incredible resources, but how that's a bit like walking into an enormous library. It doesn't necessarily lead to fast, effective, or enjoyable learning. There's a balance of structure and freedom required, just like with improv itself, and there's a value in having an experienced teacher guide you through the best way to use the resources for your own learning goals. I asked Brenden for his best advice for a beginning improviser, and I loved his suggestion to approach it like building with Lego blocks. At first, you use just a few blocks, and you follow some instructions, and from there, you can start to experiment, and work your way up to ever more complex creations. I think taking that mindset to improvising, whether you're tackling jazz or any other genre, can really help make it more manageable. You assemble your own toolkit of musical concepts and ideas that you can put to use in your own creative ways when the opportunity arises. So if you are interested in learning jazz piano, then I would definitely recommend heading to Jazz Piano School, where you can learn all about their courses and get access to over 100 free episodes of their podcast. We'll have links to both of those in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode. Stay tuned for our next one, where we'll be tackling that problem of wandering lost in a library, with an overview of Musical U's new roadmap for learning to improvise.
Thank you for listening to the Musicality Podcast. This episode has ended, but your musical journey continues. Head over to musicalitypodcast.com, where you will find the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive for podcast listeners. That's Musicality.